as they advise you, you should never start your presentation by thanking the organizers for organizing a conference, by saying what a great place it is, or by explaining what your paper is going to be about. So, first of all, I want to thank Jan for putting this together. It's been absolutely great, and I feel very privileged to be part of it. Second, yes, this is a great place, and it's, I mean, academically, and the city is just amazing. And third, what am I going to talk about? I want to, what we have just heard was almost one subsection of my paper. I originally put it under the title, "Only Some Theory Can Save Us." Yeah, and then I thought it's too pretentious, and I got rid of it.
I don't shy away from that.
Yeah. And I found it absolutely fascinating. You know that I'm quoting both Sasha and Matthias here, and I'm trying to show that theoretical imagination is something very different from social imaginary. So it's almost like taking a step back and trying to understand, among other things, what theoretical imagination means within social imaginary. And when Jan put this together, I thought, well, that's great. I'm gonna revisit and reread Karl Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia after 20 or I realized 30 years, because believe it or not, Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia was one of very first translations of non-Marxist sociology in post-1989 Czechoslovakia. So I picked up my paperback copy published by the Slovak publisher in Czech translation, and I went through all the mark and all scribbles that I put there, and I realized what a great book it is. But it treats both ideology and utopia as false consciousness. And imagination, and so yeah, there is an element of Marxism in Mannheim, but as we know, he had great fights with Horkheimer and the critical school when he was in Frankfurt, and then it all ended up in London and California and New York, of course. And it's so imaginary is and imagination are two very different things, because imagination describes always or represents the world as it could be. There is potentiality, and even there's potentiality in different theories, theoretical images. And in the European context, European imagination is typically associated with potentiality and viability of further European integration and the EU's future as such. It is invoked in both theory and practice, or policies, we just heard about it, and to stimulate and legitimize this process and stabilize European institutions and their functioning. However, unlike these normative expectations, are a heavy burden on any form of social imagination, and they get confronted by imaginaries operating in modern society irrespective of its political practices or theoretical knowledge. Unlike imagination, social imaginaries are not theoretical constructs, because they precede theoretical knowledge, and they refer to the ways people imagine and share their social existence. They are, to use Charles Taylor, common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. So the problem with the concept of imagination is then that first, it is a response to the crisis, and it's almost some kind of nostalgia. Those were the times when we had the imagination of Europe. Yeah, we have to reinvent it. We have to reinvigorate European project by having the European imagination. Second reason is more narcissistic, because which theorist wants to have his or her theory described as unimaginative? Yeah, that it's a non-starter. So against this background of these two reasons about imagination, I want to highlight the sociological meaning of the concept of imaginary as background power of both transnational and national legal and political systems, which determines legitimacies and illegitimacies in EU law and politics. For that reason, I will analyze specific European imaginaries, and I will skip theoretical imagination such as Mill's sociological imagination, Collingwood's historical imagination, James Boyd White's legal imagination, or even Martin Laughlin's constitutional imagination, because they are theoretical tools which help us to understand better. They are basically interpretive tools, Mills would say, to define the meaning of the social sciences for the cultural tasks of our time. If you read the book, which is 70 years old now, almost. It's a devastating critique of Talcott Parsons in the name of humanist sociology. Yeah? Today, if you mention the concept of humanist sociology, people would look at, what do you mean? Yeah, some kind of nilly-willy. Yeah, this is what we call socio-legal studies. Policymakers, policy advisors, they always know better. It's almost a negative concept. Yeah, but historically, this was the role of imagination. When we talk about imaginaries, we don't talk about ideology, either ideology or utopia, and we're not talking about simulacra, what Schmidt described as simulacra of creating a mirror effect which makes it impossible to get to the real foundations, structures and workings of modern society and politics. As you know, I'm very skeptical about ontologies. We always look into deontology, and we always think about history of social imaginaries as those preconditions. And if you look at Taylor's imaginaries, what does he talk about? Market, rights, and power, which is publicly accountable. And that's why I liked so much Sasha's comment. He said, Europe was a liberal project, and we can discuss how radical you want to be in your liberalism, but it had this liberating, constraining effect at the same time. So it is about market, it is about rights, and of course it is about power accountability. Our current crisis is that there are not political but societal powers which evolve and which which have significant impact without any accountability. The problem is accountability here. But these three imaginaries of modern social imaginaries are complicated in thinking about Europe by two theoretical imaginations. And they are, of course, they have practical impact. The first one is constructive optimism, which is typical element of neo-functionalist theories of the 1950s. Sooner or later, political integration will catch up with economic integration. This is basically Marxism, yeah? Substructure and superstructure. You will create the market, and then you will have the political union. Now we know we are in the inverse situation. We have a political project with serious economic consequences, and they are not positive. Yeah, they are very detrimental. To this, second imagination is deconstructive pessimism, which is which consists of constant warnings against the risk of repeating the horrors of war and excesses of power of the nation state. This is what we heard that is post-sovereignty German or not. But of course, when you criticize statehood as such, as an institution, you are at risk of diminishing democratic values which are entrenched in post-war democratic state. However, we also have to bear in mind that these imaginations were running against the other imagination which was there, which was post-sovereign, which was post-national, which was communist. European project was running as parallel to the communist alternative of their post-national, post-state. State would wither away, and we would administer every social need, and people would take what they need, not what they want. Yeah? And so how do you structure Europe? Of course, as a liberal project. Yeah? And the risk is, of course, that Europeans, theorists and politicians will run into the same problem like Marxists, described so beautifully by Ernest Gellner, that who said that Marxist expectation that the boundaries between nation states will be weakened and eventually disappear when members of those nations realize that their nationalist sentiments are only ideological masks, hiding real causes of their conflicts and existential hardship. So theorists of European integration are running similar risk, say that if you realize humanist potential, you realize the false simulacra of nationalism, we will end up with good Europe. European integration has its own specific imaginaries: economic performativity, social engineering, legal pluralism, and political mobilization. So what I want to argue is that these imaginaries, however, are not foundational. They don't provide for any foundation of the economic constitution, legal constitution, political. No, they are internally paradoxical. And I will go very quickly through each of them, and especially economic constitution with its imperium of prosperity and the idea of spontaneity. Let the markets work their way against political enforcement. Spontaneity against enforcement, which actually then returns with the imperial aspect of market. The market knows best, and the force of the market creates its own imperium. Yeah? Diktat. Imaginary of social engineering and administrative depoliticization. This goes back to Saint-Simon 200 years ago. Can you imagine? There are parasitic men who produce nothing and want to consume. Yeah? His critique of consumerist society is, of course, driven by those who produce. They are the worthy humankind. Industrialists and administrators. Of course, the idea that this will go to social administration and disappearance of politics is utterly wrong, because calculemus of social administration has its own political effects, and it is politics par excellence. As Christian Jürges correctly and critically notes, while governance arrangements seek the law's support, they also challenge the law's rule through a de-juridification of the polity. This is very important to remember. No? And this is, again, something that we heard about. We just learned about imaginary of pluralism, constitutional pluralism, described as the monism of cosmopolitan values. Two finest adherents and promoters of this idea are here with us. And again, wonderful paradox through legitimation function that you have, that you believe that even legal pluralists can embrace substantive values of the liberal polity and reconstitute them beyond statehood at European and global constitutional levels. So it's the problem, of course, is that values, including cosmopolitan values, are becoming symbols of societal unity, but they can be contested. That's why Europe of values will be increasingly conflictual along ideological lines of nativism against cosmopolitanism, conservatism against socialism, populism of all sorts against liberal constitutionalism, and so on. However, I want to finish. So this is the third specific imaginary having this interplay of ethical monism and legal pluralism, and economic imaginary spontaneity against the power of against enforcement. You have the final imaginary of democratic mobilization beyond the people. It's interesting, Matthias spoke about constitutional moment. Mike didn't mention the momentum, but this idea that there is a moment, it's either with us or around the corner, we just gonna make it. It's the fallacy of Derrida and Habermas of 2004. Now we have the constitutional momentum. You absolutely correctly criticize. I completely agree with this critique. But what can democratically mobilize beyond the people? Is it the utopian imagination of the withering away state? Hardly. We just heard, even cosmopolitan thinking believes in the protection of borders and having foreign policy. Nomos and topos matter. How do you add the third part of the holy trinity of constitutionalism, ethnos? You spoke about Europeans, but this question of identity so far has been answered, has been on the agenda of populism, of nativist populism. So I don't want to say extreme right-wing fascist there. It's already ideological labeling, but it's interesting how the mobilization now is not with the left. It's the left has very limited potential to mobilize, and it's the right which mobilizes and dictates the topics. Yeah? It's protecting borders. They would say, I told you so. Yeah? And this is, so to conclude, the problem of the European Union, that it's this anti-mobilization force. I was absolutely aghast when, by the reaction of Günther Oettinger to the Italian election. You cannot get it worse than Oettinger, who was forced to apologize. Nevertheless, the damage was done. Pardon? Yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. My concern, I will quote, my concern and expectation is that the coming weeks will show that the development of the markets, government bonds, and the economy of Italy will be so far-reaching that this will be a possible signal to voters not to vote for populists on the right or left. Yeah, he was honest, but I can tell you, if there is one thing I absolutely abhor in politics, it's honesty. And I'll tell you in a minute why. Because political mobilization is running through the promise of authentic politics. This is the semantics of populism, is authenticity. And what is the consequence of this authenticity promise is that it's populists who promise to be honest and true representative of the people's will. And it has, this is the imaginary that you can create somehow the real existentially embedded kind of politics. No, democracies are always constructions. Yeah, they always need social structures, and social structures by definition de-author. They alienate, fortunately. Yeah? Because if you don't have alienation, you will end up with what Zygmunt Bauman calls explosive communities. This is the second sub-imaginary of populism. So populism runs on the imaginary of authenticity and explosive communities, which, as Bauman says, it's a communitarian response to the global nomadism which reinvents specific globalized forms of societal tribalism and leads to the constitution of these explosive communities, filling the void of meaning created by globalization. This is written almost 20 years ago. It very well captures the current situation. I know. The current situation of global, European and local politics, because it shows that there will always be this call for the meaningful life, because this is what imaginaries in the end produce. But this clash between authentic promise of populist politics and the actual creation of explosive communities which are a defense mechanism, it's something which eventually is the biggest threat for the European project, and the only bad news is that I don't have any good news, because Europe doesn't have an alternative to this. Yeah? And here I stop.
I think you usefully highlight the liberal core idea of the view. In fact, listening to you made me think that Matthias's project, using the language of non-domination, is really a Republican project. The language of non-domination is often associated, as you know, with a different tradition of freedom from the liberal tradition. And I think it's a more rich one in many ways. You could tell a story of post-sovereignty and its return. I used more materialist literature, but you could tell a similar story to the one I told through the language of republicanism. I think Richard Bellamy is to some extent involved in a parallel project. But my two small comments on the early post-war history is you very quickly glossed over what I think is an important difference, which is between democratic values and democratic practice. Sure, the values of restrained democracy are democracy. But that in that oxymoron, we already see the problem. Democracy is a practice. And in that sense, I think we can really go a little bit further than you might want to in terms of the post-democratic liberal ideology of which I think begins already in the founding period, but which is exaggerated and accelerated through various subsequent events. I think my question. Sorry, I know. Sub-note on that. Patrikanis is already gone. 47. The withering away of the state. Yes. Stalin's got rid of him a long time before we begin with European integration. That's a good historical thing. The question I think relates to the Horkheimer-Mannheim dispute, which you alluded to, and which is I track it a little bit in my paper as well. Mannheim generalizes the idea of false consciousness. We're all products of, or our ideas are products of false consciousness. Great. And he uses the example of Machiavelli. The palace has one idea and the plebs the other.
Yes.
Horkheimer throws it back at it with this story that Machiavelli also tells of the Florentine underclass.
Yes.
Who realize the misery of their situation has been imposed on them by above. It's not simply two equal forms of false consciousness. It's the one which maintains the universal, in the Marxist tradition, the universal agent of change precisely because it is aware of its exploitation. So could we, or need we not go back to a more Horkheimerian concept of ideology, which can then bring back the emancipatory tradition, which is to some extent, I think, gone with Mannheim's positivism.
Before you answer, I'll collect a few more questions. Matthias first.
Just and listening to this exchange, there is a false dichotomy which I'm not very happy about that's taking place here. So liberal versus Republican has a great tradition, of course, and there is a straightforward liberal position which is about rights and the individual and nothing else. And then there's a Republican tradition, Rousseauian kind, and it's about. But that's a false dichotomy. I mean, if you think that that's the only game in town, either that or that, and within a Habermasian republicanism, you insist on the co-equality of private and public freedoms. and of equal weight, and they have to be perpetually in a contestatory public process, be renegotiated.
He tries to unite them, but he's aware of their different historical
Yes,
traditions.
of course, there's a historical traditions, but if we're asking how should we think and reconstruct or criticize existing practices, we can't just say it's this, we want that, or we want that, probably. What we want is to institutionalize appropriate structures which allow us to collectively contest the respective boundaries that have been drawn between the public and the private by relevant actors, and be able to critically reflect on that. So that means we don't want to give up individual liberties, the liberal side, if you so like, and we certainly don't want to give up the potential for collective action and collective institutionalization of what it is that we desire and we think furthers the public good. It's we have to keep those always present. This is a tension that cannot be resolved. It can only be adequately institutionalized. So that's and if we think about the European, that's the magic of the language of constitutionalism, by the way, because it doesn't say just human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Now, in the real historical trajectories, there are strong tensions between all of the three of those. They're not only interpretively very open, but there are strong tensions there. But the core idea is that these tensions are not simply resolved one way or another, but the point is to productively institutionalize those tensions, to allow for certain practices of participatory contestation to exist.
And a final question from Jan, and then you get the floor, please.
It's a question which in fact reflects on the ambiguity I have in the title of the conference, which is about imagination, and then the title of my project, which is about imaginaries. And I'm just not sure that you can separate the two in the way you did, since if I got it correctly, then imagination to you is about potentiality, about what can be imagined, what the world would be, whereas imaginary is something real among the people. But it's also very imagining what would be, like the kind of myths and stories people tell to themselves so that they can share these common practices. So there is an imaginative element in imaginary as well. No?
This almost sounds like Zoran Oklopčič. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for great questions. It's first, Mike. Post-war contradictions, democratic values, democratic practice, I completely agree. Yeah, but post-war was not. There were democratic mobilization, and how fragile the systems were. Communist Party of France, yeah, the second most popular Communist Party elected in democratic election. The most popular, the highest percentage was won by Czechoslovak Communist Party. Yeah, and it's and French communists got almost as many votes.
Italians were not far behind.
And they were, yeah, but significantly less. Yeah, because so the system was fragile. So how much, in what direction do you want to mobilize? Yeah, and imagine democratic practices. You put the whole system at stake. Yeah? What sort of regime are we going to end up with? British socialism, the quiet revolution of the 1945. I'm still fascinated by how it was done, yeah, in a typical British way. Nobody noticed, but overnight we had a socialism, yeah, welfare state, so this. I don't want to say false dichotomy of the theory and practice, but I think it was very fluid after the war. And those who say, for instance, that Czechoslovakia was doomed to end up in the communist camp because it was liberated by the Red Army and fell into Stalin's persecution. Until 1947, it was still possible Czechoslovakia would end up like Finland. Yeah? So you had many different models and also many different accommodations into the new post-war order. So again, let's not forget the international context here. And I agree, liberalism can be very authoritarian, yeah, very, very limiting. But then, is democratic mobilization always to the good? If I ask like a cosmopolitan thinker, yeah, that what is the value of democratic mobilization? And I'm not Habermas. I don't believe that
I don't
the
think
more...
I don't think Habermas is Habermas.
Yeah, Habermas is not Habermas anymore. Yes, it's give me good old Habermas back. No, but it's interesting how Habermas believes that the more public discourse, the more political deliberation, the more legitimacy you create, you generate, and we know it's not true. Yeah, that. Weber was right when he said that these specialists without a spirit can actually generate legitimacy. The problem of current Europe is that specialists without spirit produce a lot of delegitimation. Yeah? The question is there some spirit to counter specialists' reason? Pashukan Stalin administration against the state, well, wasn't Stalin a great dialectician who combined the administrative force? He was just a secretary general, bureaucratic role. Through the bureaucracy, he imposed the worst tyrannical rule imaginable, or non-imaginable. Yeah? So it's interesting how he actually used Pashukanis's idea of administration, but not for spontaneity, and but for strict. Yeah. Mannheim, Horkheimer. I think you're absolutely right that we can learn from this conflict a lot, and Horkheimer's concept of ideology can teach us as much about imagination as Mannheim's critical use of sociology of knowledge as a way of understanding politics. That's interesting that the book is not about sociology per se. It's about how can we have the science of politics. And the sociology of knowledge leads us to better understanding of politics. And this is where I get to Jan's question about that you cannot separate imagination and imaginaries. Absolutely not. Yeah, but there is this strong belief in Mannheim that the sociological method can remove false consciousness from both theory and practice, from social imaginaries and social imagination. So there is this, I'm more skeptical about it, I don't share this view, but he believed that that sociology of knowledge has this self-cleansing effect on the body of knowledge in society. And Matthias' false dichotomy of liberal Republican constitutionalism, but this is the way we like to think about constitutionalism. Yeah, this is our problem. I agree, this is artificial, but it helps us to understand why constitutional democracy can be at the same time constraining and empowering, mobilizing and authoritative. And so we play different distinctions and dichotomies of political constitutionalism through this, I agree, I wouldn't say false, but artificial construct.